So thank you very much to Science and Engineering South for inviting us and for offering us the opportunity to talk. I just want to say on behalf of Les and myself, we're really sorry that we haven't been able to be here for the whole day. It's just unavoidable. But the programme looks fantastic, and I'm sure that it's, really hope you have a good afternoon after we've had to leave. As Tobias said, I'm a sociologist by way of geography, and Les is a computer scientist. And we've worked together for more than 10 years now, which is quite unusual in the world of academia to have this collaboration across the social and the computational sciences. We've been working together on a project that has the title of Web Science, and usually people don't know what web science means, and quite often if I say web science to anybody outside the university, they think I'm saying that I make websites, and then we have to have a really awkward conversation about how that's not what I meant. But web science is the interdisciplinary approach to anything to do with the web data, web architecture, how people use the web, how the web is changing, anything and everything to do with the web and data that are associated with the web we've been working on together. And as part of that, therefore, you can imagine that we've spent quite a lot of time thinking about ethical issues in relation to all of that. So ethical issues in relation to how we collect data, how we research, but also ethical issues around AI, algorithmic decision-making, algorithmic bias, all of these kinds of issues. When we talk about ethics, and this is very crude, this threefold distinction, Les has got a really good way of summing it up that's even cruder in a moment, but I'm going to say it my way first. I want to just position what we're going to say in the context of three different forms or three different paradigms for thinking about ethics, and they are, of course, really deeply interrelated to each other. So the first one is, I've called it the minimalist, with apologies to Alison and other lawyers in the room, but it's what is legal. How do we handle the legal questions and what is not legal in relation to our work as web scientists? Really important. The second set of ethical practices are around what we think we should do that are good practice. So questions around governance in terms of things like informed consent, anonymity, feeding our research findings back to our participants, behaving in a way which we think is ethically appropriate in relation to our research. And then the third, probably by far least familiar way of thinking about ethics, and is that we think about it in terms of what I'm calling here representational responsibility. And what I mean by that is that we have an ethical responsibility to think about how we describe and how we represent the people, also the institutions, perhaps even the artifacts that we are working with as researchers. How do we describe and present our subjects to the world? And what kinds of claims do we make about the subjects that we present to the world? And I would suggest, I haven't moved that slide, never mind. I would suggest that we do have a responsibility to act in a way which is fair and reasonable and doesn't do harm in terms of the way that we present the subjects of our research. Les, sum that up.
My summary of that is there's the part of ethics that will get you locked up, the part of ethics that will make you feel guilty, and the part of ethics where people will point at you and laugh if you don't actually do this part right. That's basically it.
Hopefully they'll point at you and laugh. So the reason that we are going to talk today about this third kind of ethics, which I guess is very different from the sort of discussions that you've been having this morning, or that may well have been part of the discussions you're having. That's what we want to concentrate on right now. And we want to concentrate on it because we, as part of our research in the Web Science Institute, have spent quite a lot of time thinking about social media data. There are, of course, ethical questions in terms of the law about what we can do with social media data and the conventional ethical practice, making you feel guilty or not in relation to social media data. But the reason that we want to talk about that today is because we have, frankly, both of us, from the social side and from the computational side, seen some of the most appalling papers ever and the most ethically disturbing papers ever in that third sense of ethics in some of the work that we've seen around social media analytics. And I say that in this context, a context in which a lot of people are really, really interested in social media data. So we've done a study where we look at the number of papers using social media data. It shoots up throughout the late 2000s on into the 2010s. People are very, very excited. They use words like naturally occurring data. They use words like a telescope. At last we have a telescope on the world, or we have a mirror of the world, because we have these large data sets that tell us what people are thinking and doing and who they are in real time, over time, and at scale. So there's been a great deal of enthusiasm for this. There's also been a great deal of skepticism about social media data. Skepticism, as John Goldthorpe quoted here, says in terms of what we can actually know from social media data. And this sums up the kind of skepticism that John Goldthorpe, he doesn't develop it in this way, but that he might be talking about. If you think of scraping a load of Twitter data, imagine you've just harvested 10 million tweets and you want to say something about well-being and happiness. You want to say something about whether people living in Southampton or Portsmouth are the happiest. Now, I kid you not, there is a very, very well-regarded and well-respected paper on social media analytics that does precisely that, although not for these two cities. If we think of what the methods section might look like for that paper, there are very rarely methods sections in social media analytics, actually. But if we think of what it might look like, it would look something like this. The first line, it wouldn't look anything like that. It would look something like this. The first line would be, okay, we've conducted a survey and we've got information on 10,000 people. Okay, so we've looked at 10,000 accounts. We don't know how these 10,000 people were selected. We've got no idea at all how they were selected, because the company that collected the data for us doesn't tell us. But they did give us the data, so that was good. But we do know at some point that the people in this data set said something or were connected in some way to the words Southampton and Portsmouth. These might not be 10,000 unique individuals. It's possible that's not actually 10,000 people. We have no way of knowing. Some people might have filled in the questionnaire multiple times. In brackets, some people might have multiple accounts. I have 3 Twitter accounts, so I'm 3 people in that data set already. Some people, probably up to about 20%, aren't people at all. They're actually automated accounts. They're bot-run accounts rather than people. Some people, and we don't know which is which. Often there's lots of computational methods attempting to define which are bot accounts, but it's not necessarily easy to tell, and increasingly difficult in some ways to tell which is which. Different people have filled in different versions of the form. So when you use Twitter on your phone or on different kinds of devices, or you use it on a different piece of software on your PC, the form, effectively the way in which your data is collected and harvested and the metadata and so on may be slightly different. So effectively you're filling in a different form. We've categorised people into those from Southampton and Portsmouth based on location information which maybe between 3 and 5% of them have used, that have supplied using GPS information on the Twitter account. And for the rest of it, we've kind of guessed based on where they say they are and whether or not they use the word Southampton or Portsmouth in their tweets. We've analysed this data, this small, not exhaustive, quite subjective, with a small, exhaustive and really quite subjective set of words that we've decided are positive or negative. If we're talking about sentiment analysis, we've decided what the positive words are, what the negative words are, and overall we conclude that people living in Southampton are happier than those people living in Portsmouth. That, seriously, if the methods section for much Twitter research was actually written out in that way, that's what it would look like. Thinking about it another way, if you imagine we said, well, we've got some interview data. We found this interview data lying in shredded strips in the street. We don't know which strips go together. We don't know who the people are, but we're going to put them together and we're going to use them as our data source. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? So that's the extreme version of the skepticism. Actually, I'm not a skeptic about using social media data, and I think it has huge potential. The problem is that we're not getting past that kind of methodological approach in many ways to using the data. And so what Les is going to do now is to say a bit about how we might move on from that and start to do research with social media data that is more ethical in terms of that representational issue. So we don't make not only silly claims that people will laugh at us for, but claims that I would say are unethical about the status of people, about what matters to people, about how people feel. And we know that these data are being used by governments, they're being used by businesses to sell things, to contribute to understandings for social policy. In my view, that is deeply unethical if it's underpinned by this kind of very poor methodology. So I've done the easy bit. Les is now going to tell you how to solve it.
I'm not entirely sure that's what we agreed. And perhaps what the point is we haven't solved this yet. But I think what we want to encourage people to do is to try and internalise this discussion. Now, this is a discussion session. Partly it's discussion between us as researchers. Partly it's a discussion between sort of two different disciplinary backgrounds. But we want to internalise that discussion, perhaps, in the people who research, in the researchers' minds. We wrote a paper, we presented it. It was a while ago. I was just about to have to ask you how this device works. But
I wish you had. I really wish you had.
Turns out you have to press it harder. So the questions that the kind of we want to make you think about the questions that Susan's already presented. We sort of picked on the metaphor of the data pipeline, partly because it implies that sort of data is travelling through a manufactured process. There is a pipeline, like an oil pipeline, which didn't naturally occur in nature. And whatever it is that it's carrying, there has been a lot of engineering done to make that data flow to where it is needed. And even the construction of this pipeline of data, so we may get hold of a lot of Twitter data, and we talk about Twitter because that is the social media platform which has the most open agreements in terms of what data is available, how it's made available, the mechanisms by which it is made available, and the very clear terms and conditions about how it can be used. So, some of the legal things are really quite clear. However, it is very socio-technical, and it is a business. So this pipeline that brings to us this wonderful amounts of data, of people's opinions, apparently, of the statements that they make when they are not filling out forms from researchers, asking questions that have been devised according to some research methodology, things that people are doing and saying in a less controlled way. The pipeline that brings all that to us is heavily engineered and has changed many times in the 10 years that sort of Twitter has been around. Twitter, again, I've said about why we always talk about Twitter. People often say it is the lamppost that we can look for our keys underneath because that's where the light is. We have to be aware of this thing. We have to be aware that the data exists and is brought to us for business reasons, and it is shaped in ways which make Twitter more useful and viable as a business, not more transparent, if you like, in the data that it brings to us, or in any sense to our advantage. So there are three issues that we've tried to think about. One is just about the population. And there are a number of issues of that. The demographics, what kind of people have access to this platform, this social media platform? What do they look like? How many of them are there? They say that Facebook, for example, is for people who are trying to show off to their family. and that Twitter is for people who are trying to show off to complete strangers. They say that Twitter is for people who are screaming into the void. These things are used for very different reasons, and they're used by very different demographics. Twitter, on the whole, is not used by younger people, but then neither is Facebook anymore. Who are the people, and why are they doing it? We live in a world in which, although I said that, there is this hope, or Susan said, there is this hope that it uncovers to us or provides for us a mirror of what is going on in the real world. In fact, we live in a world in which we have all been taught, that we have to provide our social media profile. It is a way for us to get on. We have to tweet, make people, want to connect to us, improve our network so that we can get jobs. So there is a whole set of performances going on. The kinds of people that you get doing this do not necessarily give you a balanced survey sample. Simply trying to understand location information. Different social media platforms give you different amounts of information. Twitter actually gives you somewhere to write in your profile, where are you from? Where are you? What is your location? And different people will fill that in differently. We've got the actress Anna Kendrick there, who says her location is probably by the food. I just put down Southampton. Some people actually put down coordinates in there. So how you represent your location, does it mean it is where you are normally or where you are when you're tweeting at the moment? There are all sorts of issues about how you understand location. And it's a huge crossover with privacy concerns. And then the actual, we talk about Twitter users, we should talk about Twitter accounts. There you have individuals, sort of autonomous users, myself perhaps. You have corporate accounts being operated for a company. You have accounts that are being operated for celebrities by their staff. You have trolls. You have bots, you have accounts, hundreds of thousands of accounts that are actually being controlled by computer programs that are tweeting automatically. You have botnets, they're controlled perhaps by state actors. We've heard so much about this now. It is very difficult to tell what is going on. One of the things I forgot to say was about the pipeline. I've got it shown at the bottom of this slide. The way that things go from the subject, the person who is tweeting, the software that they're using. There are many different sorts of software that they might use. They might have a Twitter app on their iPhone, which is what I use sometimes, or they might be filling out a form on the Guardian newspaper in response to something that they've just seen. Other newspapers are available. But it might shape their response to something. They may be prompted to do it on an app that they're using to watch a television show. It might be encouraging them to fill out a particular kind of response for a particular kind of action. But each of these is more or less neutral. They're on different types of software, they're on different types of hardware, different kinds of devices. Your watch may be tweeting, you may be tweeting using your iPhone, your Fitbit, whatever health tracking application might be tweeting about your run without you actually having to do anything, well, apart from run. And these are all controlled by APIs, application programming interfaces, which define what the business will respond to, what sort of data questions on the computers, and these keep changing all the time. What you can know, what you can ask, how you ask it, how much data you will get, under what circumstances. So these keep changing all of the time, and the way that and then the pipeline is actually much more complicated than one straightforward flow through to the server software and the database back at Twitter HQ. That different kinds of organisation have different kinds of access by paying different kinds of money and different business contracts. Or you can just be using a browser, a web browser, Chrome, whatever, and you as a researcher can scrape. You can copy and paste things from there. There are all sorts of ways of getting data, but the platform typically, and Twitter definitely, will refuse to give you too much data. It will limit the amount of data you're allowed to ask. It will make you, ask for a batch of data every 15 minutes or something like that, which might mean that you cannot collect all the data that you need because there's simply not enough capacity in that allowed request for you to see everything as it streams by, the hundreds of millions of tweets that are happening every day. And then the methods that you use and the tools that you use and the way that you store the data, do you put it in a spreadsheet, have you got it in a database, dictate the kinds of questions that you can ask. You might wish to ask about, I want to know everything from all of the medical professionals living in Portsmouth who've tweeted about a particular topic under particular circumstances. Whether you can do that will depend on the kind of database that you have and any other kinds of data that you're joining to it. In our paper, we've tried to summarize everything in a nice table, just to encourage you that when you get hold of this data, to think critically about the limitations on it. Because, not sure where because this is not the answer to your questions, all right? Having 10 million tweets, as Susan just said, is the beginning, is part of, it is something, but it's not the end. It's part of your research journey that will inform you of all sorts of stuff. Shall I just tell the...
Yep.
So, for example, working with one of my PhD students who was very interested in a particular kind of attitude that people and practice that people were developing around some kind of technology. And she wanted to find out more, and she'd planned a whole 3-year PhD around this. And then I suggested that we had a look at some of the evidence on Twitter. And when we looked, we realized that actually this wasn't just some grassroots movement of individuals deciding that they wanted to do such and such with a particular kind of technological artifact that they owned. There were lots, in fact, the main voices that we could see on Twitter were all commercial actors encouraging people to make a particular change. And until we'd looked at this data source, it had not occurred to us that that was a possibility. So using Twitter data to enrich our research, to kickstart our research, to have a broader understanding than perhaps our focused preconceptions can be astonishingly powerful. It certainly has been for me.
I don't think we'll say very much more now, so we've gone over time, as is always the case. I realise that might seem a little bit overpowering. I think what you've just seen is the intersection of the social and the computational. So as we use these new forms of data more and more to ask social questions, what we're saying is we need to bring to bear computational understanding and social science understanding together. And that, in doing that, we have to think really methodologically. Just because these are data that people are producing, I've just seen Wendy tweeting, you know, my watch is buzzing because Wendy's tweeting, right? So just because there's all these data around, and they are potentially exciting, but we cannot, as ethically responsible researchers, afford to apply any less methodological rigour and epistemological understanding to these data than we would try to apply to any other source of data. Now, they're not the same as any other source of data. The challenges are greater. There will always be things we don't know about these data. We are never going to have the same level of transparency, knowledge and understanding about these data as we do of data that we, you know, methods that we design and implement ourselves. But that doesn't mean we should abdicate responsibility for it. It actually makes it even more important that we take some responsibility for thinking about what the data are, how they represent people, and what kinds of claims are made from those data as they become more and more powerful so what sociologists would call a knowledge assemblage. But you know, as we move to ways of understanding the world that pull together very different and incommensurate sources of data, so they might include a survey, statistics from a census, social media data, Internet of Things data. As all of these things start to combine to make very powerful claims and really influence how the world operates, we must have better academic methodological ways of dealing with the data. That's all we want to say. Thank you.